For a long, long time, Europe pretty much kept to itself. But then, something happened. It's like a switch was flipped. In just a couple of generations, European ships went from hugging the coastlines to crossing the world's biggest oceans, stumbling upon entire continents, and, in the process, changing human history forever.
I mean, that's a huge question, right? What could possibly convince thousands of people to leave every single thing they'd ever known to sail off into a terrifying, completely unknown sea? Well, the answer isn't just one thing. It's this powerful mix of greed, faith, and ambition. So let's get into it.
So, first things first. Before we get into anything else, you have to understand that this whole story really kicks off with one thing: money. Or, more specifically, the burning desire to get incredibly rich from all the amazing goods coming out of Asia. To really get why everyone was in such a hurry, you have to picture this giant traffic jam, basically. Europeans were desperate to get their hands on Asian spices, silks, you name it. But here was the problem. The land and sea routes were completely controlled by powerful Middle Eastern empires, especially the Ottomans. And they would only sell to a couple of Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. And what did Venice and Genoa do? Well, they turned around and sold those goods to the rest of Europe for absolutely outrageous prices. So you see the problem, right? Kingdoms like Portugal, Spain, France, and England, they were completely on the outside looking in, totally cut out of this insanely profitable trade. Their solution was, frankly, a little nuts and super dangerous. They decided, forget the old routes. We're going to pour a ton of money into finding a brand new, all-water route to Asia. A route that they could control, that would cut out all the middlemen and bring all that wealth directly to them. Now, obviously, it's one thing to want to sail across the ocean, but it's another thing entirely to actually be able to do it. This massive undertaking was only possible because a few key technologies all came together at the right time. You had the magnetic compass, which came from China, letting sailors know which way was north even on the darkest nights. There was the astrolabe, a brilliant device from Muslim astronomers that let you figure out your latitude, how far north or south you were. The Portuguese came up with the caravel, a faster, more agile ship that was way easier to handle. And finally, the printing press. Gutenberg's invention meant that maps and sailing knowledge could suddenly be copied and shared all over Europe like never before.
But, as powerful as money is, it wasn't the only thing pushing these explorers out to sea. There were two other massive forces at play, things that could make people risk it all, far from home: their faith and a deep, burning desire for personal glory.
Historians have this really handy way of boiling it all down. They call it the 3 Gs. It's a great little framework. We've already talked about gold. That's the economic engine driving everything. The second G is God. Spreading Christianity was seen as a sacred duty by many rulers and explorers. And the third G is glory. This is that timeless human drive for fame, for a legacy, for power, not just for yourself, but for your king and for your entire country.
But here's the thing, that God part of the equation wasn't just one single idea. It actually went in 2 totally different directions. On one side, you had countries like Spain. They saw this as a golden opportunity to expand the Catholic Church, setting up missions and very often forcing indigenous people to convert. But then you had groups like the English Pilgrims and Puritans. They weren't trying to spread their religion to others. They were trying to escape persecution themselves. They crossed an entire ocean just to build a place where they could worship freely, far away from the official Church of England.
Okay, so you've got these big motivations: gold, God, and glory. How did that actually look on the ground? Well, it meant that the big European powers all went about building their American empires in really, really different ways. And you can see these differences so clearly when you just line them up side by side. Spain was all about gold, silver, and converting people. That led to a strategy of conquest and enslavement. France, on the other hand, didn't find gold, so they focused on the fur trade. And to do that, you needed to build business partnerships with Native American tribes. Then there was England. They had a mix of goals. They wanted natural resources and cash crops, but also that religious freedom we talked about. Their relationship with indigenous peoples started out kind of friendly, for trade and survival. But as the English colonies grew and needed more land, that relationship turned hostile. Jamestown, which was founded back in 1607, is just the perfect case study for the English approach. This wasn't just a fort or a trading post. The goal here was to create a permanent settlement. People came to stay, to build farms, to raise families, and to create a whole new society. And that ambition would have some really profound and totally unexpected consequences. And this led to one of the biggest, most important consequences of all, something the kings and queens back in Europe absolutely never saw coming: the beginnings of self-government.
This all happened because of a concept called salutary neglect. It sounds fancy, but the idea is actually super simple. Basically, as long as the American colonies kept making money for the English crown, the king kind of just left them alone. It wasn't an official law or anything, it was just practical. I mean, trying to micromanage a colony from 3,000 miles away was nearly impossible. But this healthy neglect created a power vacuum, and the colonists jumped at the chance to fill it. They got really, really used to running their own show.
And wow, once this started, it moved fast. Just look at the timeline. In 1619, you have the Virginia House of Burgesses, the very first elected assembly in the American colonies. Just 1 year later, in 1620, the Pilgrims signed the Mayflower Compact, this groundbreaking agreement to govern themselves by majority rule. And by 1639, Connecticut has the first written constitution in the colonies. These weren't just random events. They were the actual building blocks of a brand new way of thinking about government. That Mayflower Compact, especially, I mean, you can't overstate how radical of an idea that was back then. It was a contract, an agreement between people to create their own laws for the general good. This little document, signed on a cramped ship in a cold harbor, planted one of the most important seeds for what would become American democracy. But, and this is a huge but, this whole story is full of deep, painful contradictions. For every step towards freedom and every new beginning you find in this era, you also find a story of incredible brutality, exploitation, and devastating loss. This new connection between continents kicked off something we now call the Columbian Exchange, and it was a two-way street that changed, well, pretty much everything. The Americas gave Europe things like potatoes and corn, crops that caused a massive population boom over there. Europe brought over horses, which completely transformed life for native nations on the Great Plains. But Europe also brought diseases, like smallpox. The indigenous peoples had zero immunity, and the result was a demographic catastrophe on a scale that is just hard to comprehend. This new global economy was built on a really brutal system: the triangular trade. The way it worked was just coldly efficient. You had raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and cotton from the Americas going to Europe. In Europe, they were turned into manufactured goods like guns and textiles. Those goods were then sailed to Africa and traded for people. And that one leg of the journey, the one that carried millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean in horrific conditions, that had a name. It was called the Middle Passage.
No description I can give you can even come close to the reality of that journey. For that, we have to listen to the words of the people who actually survived it, people like Oludua Iguiano. He wrote, "The closeness of the place almost suffocated us. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror. It was a system of almost unimaginable cruelty, and it was the horrific foundation that much of the New World's wealth was built on."
So we're left with this incredible, difficult paradox, aren't we? This era, the age of exploration, gave birth to these inspiring new ideas about liberty and self-government. But at the very same time, it created and perfected one of the most brutal systems of human exploitation the world has ever seen. The search for gold, God, and glory literally built a new world, but its legacy is this tangled mess of freedom and slavery, of opportunity and oppression. And that really brings us to the final question we have to ask ourselves. How do those two competing legacies continue to shape our world, our arguments, and our lives, even today?